move on to Victoria's section now. Victoria's got a few issues to wrap up for us.
I've got two bits of the question. I want to quickly just cover safety, which is something we haven't talked about much this morning, and then look upon to the future and improving bus provision. Particularly on performance, I think many of us have been conscious of various letters and correspondence that we've had, and obviously I don't want this meeting to pass without at least touching on the number of collisions that's happened. For example, I believe that according to figures that you've given us from TfL, since April 2007, TfL buses have been involved with 500 and so recorded collisions, of which just shy of 5,000 have involved pedestrians. And inevitably, that's very expensive, and particularly with Cllr, I notice on your job title you have performance in there. What analysis or revision or review of the cost do you do incurred by London as a result of these collisions? Because what steps are TfL undertaking to try and reduce your average of over 66, I think it is, collisions per day?
I mean, we put a huge amount of effort into trying to reduce the number of collisions and improve the safety of our buses.
Cllr, I'm really sorry.
Sorry, I've got a cold.
These mics, you just need to get a little bit closer.
Sorry, I'll just repeat then. We put an enormous amount of effort into reducing the number of collisions, or just increasing the safety of a bus service. We investigate and in partnership with the bus operators every collision that takes place, understand why it happened, what can be done to change it, and so on.
You do, or the contractors who run the buses do?
Between
just
us,
give that opportunity
so we require the
bus
operators. The bus operators would in fact do a detailed investigation anyway themselves.
For every bus collision?
Yes, for any significant bus.
Sorry. And for the correction of the record and for the minutes, for every bus collision? Or for every significant bus collision, in your words?
Yeah, there'll be the odd collision which is just very, very minor, that won't lead to a detailed examination. But if anything of any significance, anything where anybody has been hurt, would be investigated.
So presumably if you get hit by a big red bus, whether it's a current one or a new one, that doesn't change the fact that obviously that's extremely painful and
yes.
Difficult experience for the pedestrian. So are you assuring us that all pedestrian and bicycle collisions, of which I believe there are some 12,000 or so,
any ones where people get hurt, yes, we would. Lots of bikes, for example, would clip a bus and nothing more come of it. But those wouldn't necessarily merit a huge investigation. Anything where anybody has had any hurt or any significant collision will be fully investigated. Say the bus companies would do that anyway. We make sure that that's done.
How do you do that?
We oversee it. First of all, we require operators to report every collision to a central database that we hold. We then monitor what they've done about it. We might send our own investigators in to investigate if we're not happy with the. So, for example, if a bus was to lose a wheel, we would send independent engineers in to make absolutely. It happens very, very rarely, but if that was to happen, we would send an independent investigator in to find out the source of that sort of problem. Otherwise, the bus operators are required to investigate fully. We will make sure they do it. We'll make sure they do it in a timely manner. If any of those things aren't happening, we will go in and talk to them, make sure it's done, and make sure that the lessons learned are implemented.
So what would success or failure look like?
Success is obviously a significant reduction in the number of collisions.
Do you have a target?
And in the severity. No, you shouldn't. We all have targets for reducing the numbers, but there's never an acceptable number of people killed.
No, I used to work for a public company.
You should not set targets. The target is to reduce that number very significantly.
I used to work for a public company, and we used to have a target of 0.
Yes, exactly. That is the target. There can be no target.
I think it would be more reassuring to those watching that we felt that TfL also had that, rather than just a view about reduction. I think the public would be much more reassured if they felt that TfL also shared that.
Of course we aspire for zero. Of course we do, and no reasonable organisation wouldn't. We're absolutely not complacent about the collision records and the people who are injured and so on. But I think it would be worth saying for the record that, and I hope Mark will agree with this, a very considerable number of our extended TfL family of bus drivers work for 5 and 10 and 15 and 20 years without any incidents whatsoever. And actually that is a tremendous testimony to the professionalism and the skill of the bus drivers that the bus contractors employ. Inevitably, as a result of employing a very large number of bus staff, there will be those who are not quite as proficient as others, and I'm absolutely satisfied that all of our bus contractors have got in place a really robust mechanism for investigating, deciding on the fault, trying to remedy those faults, and where necessary, terminating the employment of those people who are not safe to be allowed to drive buses in London. And I'm very satisfied about that. And I commend all the work that's being done by the operators and inside our own organisation for the attempts to further reduce the collisions and injuries, and we won't stop doing that.
Great. Well, obviously, I was obviously earlier on we talked about the questions to ask as well. So, if I may, I'll move on from the safety on to
the last few. I think.
Yeah. As I said, let's move on to the section we want to do here. One of the things that, again, that's concerned us around this table is, as you say, and it's come up with several different questions, is whether we can look at a different way of bus planning and routes. We've talked about flexible ticketing, we've talked about 1 hour ticketing, we've talked about 2 hour ticketing, half a day ticketing, changing the caps on the end of how much you'd be charged in a day. And I think one of the things we're trying to look around this table is I think we all appreciate that bus use is changing. Is there some way of looking at, being a little more comprehensive reviews? We've looked at the advantages of localism and local planning and where that benefits local communities, the need for looking at hospitals, and I was absolutely devastated to understand that things can only be aspirational and don't actually have to be in fact, and I think that's certainly something we're going to follow up. So really my question to you all is, what can we do to look at, I know there have been studies done about looking at London as a grid itself rather than go on running those heritage routes, about saying, okay, let's break London down into a grid, let's look at new use. I think that's something that Val's taken up in the past. What can we do to really be a bit more impressive about the future provision of bus planning, and how can we actually be a bit more flexible about this?
I think we would say that we are what we are doing with the bus network is building on success. It is a very popular service, 6.5 million passengers a day and growing. What was done in Sheffield, perhaps Greg would agree, was in order to kick-start something that was in decline and put it back on the road to recovery. The London bus network is extraordinarily successful, demand is growing, and what we are doing is continuously monitoring the demand on that network and making adjustments where necessary. It doesn't require a kick-start and it doesn't require a revolution. What it requires is evolution, and we should be making those changes as quickly as we possibly can to cope with changing demand. The public does not like widespread changes to its bus network, and in the days when we carried out very serious reviews of the network and made overnight changes across a range of routes in an area, the public universally hated it and it caused demand to fall away. What we've discovered over time is that making adjustments to the network to cope with changes on a progressive basis is more easily understood by the public, and they like it better. The public likes simplicity and the public likes stability. It doesn't like its network changing too often, and it doesn't like a wholesale change in its area. So whilst we're very, very pleased to be as flexible as possible, I'm sure the right way to proceed is one of continuous evolution and not one where we tear the whole thing up and start again, because in any such arrangement like that, there are as many disbenefits as there are benefits, and overall the public doesn't like it.
I don't think anyone's suggesting that we should tear it all up and change it overnight, but what we are looking for is an absolute commitment from yourselves to look at alternatives, about some of the underused routes, about putting buses into areas where we haven't got enough routes. We've talked about that this morning. And could you talk a little bit about, now you keep on advocating, or your waive and pay and other technology, which does of course give you that flexibility to do any of these flexible ticketing arrangements. which you haven't really touched on as a vision.
And Victor, I'm very happy just to deal also with a point that came up last time, which is about the transfer ticket, because I know Caroline and I wouldn't be in the same room without discussing the transfer ticket at least once.
Every of us around the table.
Indeed so. Just to reiterate, there isn't a demand for the 1 hour transfer ticket, which is principally for people who are making who are making a journey that requires 2 buses, because frankly that's for the benefit mostly of people who pay cash, who are in the absolute minority. The majority of passengers are paying using Oyster or pay as you go, and if you're making two bus journeys on your outward, chances are you're making 2 bus journeys on your return, and you've already hit, after the 3rd journey, the cap on the daily bus ticket price on Oyster. So the demand for that is already met through price capping. We can talk a lot about changing the cap and changing so on, but we are actually into an area there about affecting how much revenue, because if the purpose of this is for people to pay less money, then we'll get less fares income and the demand for subsidy will be greater. So therefore, what we need to do is to maintain at least our existing fares income and to provide some sort of facility that made things cheaper for some people would cause us to have to increase the prices to compensate for other people. Like I often say, there would be disbenefits in order to pay for the benefits that were being provided. There is no doubt that now with contactless smart card, which you get from your bank, and also the full range of Oyster and so on, people have the ultimate flexible ticketing operation for bus and for rail in this city. It's far superior to what exists in many others, and it's also very cheap. I don't think it's necessary, therefore, to think about changing the bus network in order to accommodate, if you like, changes in the pricing. I'm very confident that Londoners love the flexibility that they get in the current ticketing, the suite of tickets that we make available, and most of my postbag about such things is about how wonderful the flexible ticketing in London is.
Just add one thing. There is a good potential behind Oyster, though, that you may have alluded to it in your question, which is that because of the Oyster product, we understand in a great deal more detail the kinds of trips that people are making. And it gives you a really good picture. So previously, for example, it was difficult to monitor and understand the kind of trips people were making if they got off a bus, used the tube and got back on a bus, or the scale of the interchange between buses. We would do that by passenger counts and roadside counts and so on. Oyster itself produces a really good picture of and we're feeding all that data into our planning data to understand better.
Does that mean that some of the underused routes might be changed and we could have more routes where there aren't buses?
We would say that the routes that are out there, they're not underused. They are used at a level that justifies their current frequency, or we should, as part of the constant process, we're reducing or changing the frequency. So it's a kind of constant iteration as to whether it's still the appropriate frequency. There are not huge numbers of routes out there that anybody would recognise as underused. And the test of that would be to go to any borough and say, we think Route X is underused, we're going to reduce it substantially. You would get quite a response to that.
Absolutely, but I was looking for more flexibility. I mean, we're running out of time now, but what I was looking for was more flexibility, perhaps looking at shorter routes, routes where people could change, so that you didn't have to run. If you have to run a route that takes a very long time, so it's going away from Harrow to Greenwich, inevitably you have less flexibility than a route that you can constantly run without. I mean, I think around this table we think there is still more that could be done with using the ticketing, using the information you have in order to drive through a slightly speedier change, I'm not saying overnight, in bringing more buses to more people.
Okay, and I think we would say, of course, We have been progressively shortening routes generally for years. There was nothing from Harrow to Greenwich. There's almost nothing from one side of the centre of London to the other. We've been shortening the routes because they're more reliable to run that way. It's easier to do with all the things we need to do. Short routes are what we do. However, just in this, even the discussions about short routes mean